At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller stood in the galley of USS West Virginia, 300 feet from where the first Japanese torpedo would strike in exactly 3 minutes. 22 years old, a sharecropper's son from Waco, Texas, assigned to peel potatoes and serve officers because the United States Navy had decided that the color of his skin determined his maximum possible contribution to national defense. The West Virginia was moored at Battleship Row, Ford Island, Pearl Harbor. 624 feet long, 32,600 tons, carrying 1,541 men. Miller had been aboard for 14 months. Every morning he woke at 500 hours, reported to the galley, prepared breakfast for officers, cleaned their quarters, served their meals, washed their dishes. The Navy had 170,000 enlisted men in December 1941. Approximately 4,000 were black. Every single one was restricted to mess attendant duties or steward positions. No combat training, no gunnery school, no advancement possible beyond cooking and cleaning. Miller had tried to enlist in 1939, the year he turned 20. The recruiter in Waco had been direct. The Navy would take him, but only as a mess attendant. No other ratings were open to colored men. Miller had asked about gunner positions. The recruiter said those were for white sailors only. Miller signed anyway. A sharecropper's son in Central Texas in 1939 had limited options. The Navy offered steady pay, 3 meals per day, and escape from cotton fields that would never belong to him. Boot camp at Naval Station Great Lakes lasted 8 weeks. Miller learned to make beds with hospital corners, press uniforms to exact specifications, serve meals without spilling, and stand at attention while white officers inspected his work. He learned nothing about weapons. Mess attendants were not issued rifles during training. They were not taught to operate ship defense systems. The Navy's official position was clear. Black sailors existed to support white sailors who would do the actual fighting. USS West Virginia received Miller in January 1940. The battleship had been commissioned in 1923, rebuilt in 1930s, and was now one of the most powerful vessels in the Pacific Fleet. 9 16-inch guns, 12 5-inch guns, 8 50-caliber anti-aircraft machine guns, 2,800 tons of ammunition. Miller was not trained to touch any of it. His battle station assignment was simple: remain in the galley, prepare food for damage control parties, stay out of the way. The morning of December 7th began like every other Sunday. Miller woke at 500, dressed in his white mess attendant uniform, and reported to the galley. The breakfast menu for officers included eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. He began cracking eggs at 5:30. The galley smelled like coffee and frying meat. Outside, through the porthole, he could see Ford Island and the morning sun rising over the mountains to the east. At 07:55, the first Japanese torpedo struck USS West Virginia's portside, 20 feet below the waterline. The explosion tore through the armor belt and ruptured fuel tanks. Miller was thrown against the galley bulkhead. Pots flew off shelves, hot coffee sprayed across the deck. The ship lurched to port. Emergency alarms began screaming throughout the vessel. Miller had no assigned combat duty. The Navy had not trained him for battle. His orders were to stay in the galley during general quarters, but the orders assumed the ship would remain level. West Virginia was listing 28 degrees to port and sinking. Water was flooding through the torpedo breach at 400 gallons per second. The ship had maybe 10 minutes before it rolled completely over and trapped everyone inside. Miller ran, not away from the damage, toward it. He climbed through passageways filling with black smoke. The emergency lighting had failed. He navigated by feel, hand over hand along bulkheads, climbing ladders toward the main deck. Men were screaming. Some were trapped behind jammed hatches. Others were burning from fires spreading through the forward compartments. Miller kept moving forward. At 7:58, the second Japanese torpedo hit, then the third, then the fourth. 5 more followed in the next 3 minutes. 7 torpedoes total, each carrying 450 pounds of explosives. USS West Virginia was dying. The port list increased to 35 degrees. At 40 degrees, the ship would capsize. Everyone still inside would die. Miller reached the main deck at 08:01. The scene was chaos. Japanese aircraft filled the sky. Bombs were falling. Machine gun fire raked the deck. USS Arizona, moored 75 yards away, was burning from a bomb that had penetrated her forward magazine. USS Oklahoma had already capsized, her hull visible above the water, men trapped inside pounding on the steel. If you want to see how a mess attendant with no weapons training stopped Japanese aircraft with a gun he'd never fired, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Miller. Miller found Lieutenant Commander Doyle Johnson near the conning tower. Johnson was the ship's communications officer. He had been hit by shrapnel from the first torpedo explosion. Blood poured from wounds across his chest and legs. He was conscious but unable to walk. 2 other sailors were trying to move him toward the starboard side where the list was less severe. Miller grabbed Johnson under the arms and began dragging him toward the boat deck. Johnson weighed 180 pounds. Miller weighed 220, most of it muscle from years working his family's farm before joining the Navy. He pulled Johnson across 40 feet of deck, while bullets from Japanese fighters sparked off the steel around them. They reached a sheltered position behind the No. 3 turret. Miller set Johnson down and looked back toward the conning tower. Captain Mervyn Bennion was there, wounded, trying to maintain command of his sinking ship. Bennion had taken shrapnel to the abdomen from the same explosion that hit Johnson. He was pale, bleeding, but still giving orders to the officers around him. Miller ran back through the gunfire. He reached Bennion, grabbed him the same way he'd grabbed Johnson, and began dragging the captain toward cover. Bennion was conscious, protesting, saying he needed to stay at his post. Miller ignored him. The captain outranked him by 15 pay grades, but rank meant nothing on a sinking ship with Japanese planes trying to kill everyone aboard. Bennion died before Miller could get him to cover. The captain's wounds were too severe. He died giving orders, trying to save his ship and his crew until his final breath. Miller set the body down gently and looked around for who needed help next. USS West Virginia was taking water faster than the pumps could remove it. The damage control parties were fighting a losing battle, but the counter-flooding was working. Officers had ordered flooding of starboard compartments to offset the port list from the torpedo damage. The ship was settling onto the harbour bottom instead of capsizing. Men might still escape if the list didn't increase. At 0804, Miller saw the anti-aircraft gun position. An unmanned 50 caliber Browning machine gun pointed skyward from the boat deck. The gunner assigned to that position was dead or wounded. The weapon sat silent while Japanese aircraft circled overhead, bombing and strafing everything in sight. Miller had never fired a 50 caliber machine gun. Mess attendants were not trained on weapons. He had never attended gunnery school. The Navy had specifically prohibited black sailors from operating ship armament. But the gun was there, the Japanese were there, and men were dying because no one was shooting back. Miller walked to the gun position. The weapon weighed 84 pounds, mounted on a pedestal that allowed 360 degrees of rotation. The ammunition belt was already loaded. 200 rounds of 50 caliber BMG ammunition, each round 5.45 inches long, capable of penetrating light armor at 2,000 yards. The firing mechanism was a thumb trigger on the rear grip. He had seen sailors practice with the guns during deck drills. Watched them load ammunition, cycle the action, track targets. He had never been allowed to touch the weapon himself. Now he grabbed the handles and tried to remember what he'd observed. A Japanese Nakajima B-5N bomber was banking toward West Virginia at 180 miles per hour, 800 feet altitude. The bomber had already released its torpedo. Now it was coming around for a strafing run, its 7.7mm machine gun aimed at the men on deck. Miller swung the gun toward the aircraft and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. He had forgotten to charge the weapon. The 50 caliber required manually cycling the bolt to chamber the first round. Miller grabbed the charging handle and yanked it backward. The action was stiff, requiring 25 pounds of force to operate. The bolt slammed forward with a metallic clack. The gun was hot. He pressed the trigger again. The Browning roared to life. The recoil hammered his shoulder. The noise was deafening. Brass casings ejected to the right, clattering onto the deck. The gun cycled at 500 rounds per minute. Tracers streaked across the sky toward the diving bomber. Miller had no training in deflection shooting. He did not know how to lead a moving target or compensate for the aircraft's speed. He simply pointed where he thought the bomber would be and held the trigger down. The tracers walked across empty sky, then climbed toward the aircraft's flight path. The bomber took hits along its port wing. Bright flashes marked where the .50 caliber rounds punched through aluminum skin. The aircraft shuddered, broke off its attack, and banked away, trailing white smoke. Miller swung the gun toward another target. A Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter was diving on USS Tennessee, moored directly ahead of West Virginia. The Zero's pilot was concentrating on his bombing run. He did not see Miller tracking him. Miller led the target, estimated the range at 600 yards, and fired. The tracers arced upward. The Zero flew directly through the stream of bullets. The fighter's engine exploded. The propeller tore away. The aircraft nosed over and plummeted into the harbor between Tennessee and West Virginia. The splash sent water cascading over both ships. Miller kept firing. He worked the gun left and right, tracking aircraft as they circled overhead. Some of his bursts missed completely. Others connected, forcing pilots to break off their attacks or take damage. He burned through the first 200-round belt in approximately 90 seconds. Lieutenant Frederick White appeared beside him. White was the ship's communications officer, senior surviving officer on deck after Captain Benion's death. He saw Miller operating the anti-aircraft gun and did not order him to stop. Instead, White began feeding ammunition belts into the weapon. The two men worked together. Miller fired. White reloaded. They kept the gun in action for approximately 15 minutes. The official Navy report would later credit Miller with shooting down 2 Japanese aircraft. Post-war analysis suggested the number was higher, possibly 4, but confirmation was impossible in the chaos of the battle. What was certain, Miller had operated that gun with zero training and had defended his ship while it sank beneath him. At 08:25, Lieutenant White ordered Miller to abandon the gun position and help evacuate wounded personnel. The West Virginia was settling onto the harbor bottom, bow first. Water was rising toward the main deck. Men trapped in flooded compartments were drowning. Those still on deck needed to get off before the ship settled completely. Miller spent the next 2 hours moving wounded sailors to small boats and helping seal hatches to prevent further flooding. The Japanese attack ended around 1,000 hours. By then, 2,008 American sailors and Marines were dead. 1,177 of them had died on USS Arizona when her forward magazine exploded. USS Oklahoma had capsized, trapping 429 men inside. USS West Virginia had taken 7 torpedo hits and settled to the bottom, but counter-flooding had kept her upright. 106 men aboard West Virginia died in the attack. 1,435 survived. Miller survived. He left West Virginia covered in oil and blood, most of it belonging to other sailors. He had no injuries. He reported to Ford Island for medical screening, then joined other survivors in helping recover the dead. The Navy's official casualty reports listed Miller as a mess attendant who had assisted in moving wounded personnel. There was no mention of the anti-aircraft gun, no mention of the Japanese aircraft he had shot down. The omission was not intentional malice. In the chaos of December 7th, accurate records were impossible. Thousands of men had performed heroic actions. Most went unrecorded, but Lieutenant White had noticed. White filed a report on December 10th describing how Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller had operated an anti-aircraft gun with no training and had engaged enemy aircraft effectively. The report reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, who ordered a formal investigation. The investigation confirmed White's account. Multiple witnesses testified that Miller had manned the gun. Some claimed he had shot down at least 2 aircraft. Others said they had seen him drag Captain Benion and Lieutenant Commander Johnson to safety under fire. The evidence was overwhelming. Admiral Nimitz recommended Miller for the Navy Cross. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration the United States Navy could award, below only the Medal of Honor. It had never been awarded to a black sailor. The Navy's leadership debated the recommendation for 4 months. The issue was not Miller's actions. Everyone agreed he had displayed extraordinary courage. The issue was precedent. If the Navy publicly recognized a black mess attendant for combat heroism, it would undermine the official policy that black sailors were unsuitable for combat duties. If Miller could operate an anti-aircraft gun effectively, why were other black sailors prohibited from combat training? The decision came from the top. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, approved the Navy Cross on April 1, 1942. The award ceremony took place on May 27th aboard USS Enterprise. Admiral Nimitz personally pinned the medal to Miller's chest. The ceremony was photographed extensively. The Navy released the photos to newspapers across the country. Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller became the first black American to receive the Navy Cross. The publicity was intentional. The Navy needed black Americans to support the war effort. Miller's story could help with recruiting and with maintaining support for the war in black communities that were questioning why they should fight for a country that denied them equal rights. The publicity transformed Miller into a national figure overnight. Newspapers that normally ignored black servicemen ran front-page stories. Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender celebrated Miller as proof that black Americans were just as capable as white Americans in combat. Some white newspapers were less comfortable with that message. They emphasized Miller's role in rescuing officers rather than his combat actions. Miller went on a war bond tour in 1943. He traveled to cities across the United States, speaking at rallies, selling bonds, recruiting sailors. The Navy promoted him to Mess Attendant First Class. He still served food and cleaned quarters, but now he did it with a Navy Cross on his chest. The tour ended in May 1943. Miller requested reassignment to combat duties. The Navy refused. Mess attendants remained restricted to support roles regardless of medals earned. Miller's combat experience at Pearl Harbor did not change his rating or his opportunities. Instead, the Navy assigned Miller to USS Liscome Bay, an escort carrier operating in the Pacific. He reported aboard in May 1943 and resumed his duties as a mess attendant. The ship participated in operations against Japanese-held islands. Miller served meals, cleaned quarters, and waited for another chance to prove himself. USS Liscome Bay participated in the invasion of Makin Atoll in November 1943. The carrier provided air support for Marines landing on the beaches. The operation was successful. The island fell with minimal American casualties. The carrier group prepared to withdraw. At 0513 on November 24, 1943, Japanese submarine I-1175 fired a single torpedo at Liscome Bay. The torpedo struck the carrier's starboard side near the bomb magazine. The magazine detonated. The explosion tore the ship apart. The carrier sank in 23 minutes. 644 men died in the explosion and sinking. Doris Miller was among them. He was 24 years old. The Navy listed him as missing in action, presumed dead. His body was never recovered. The official casualty notification reached his parents in Waco on December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. His mother, Henrietta Miller, received a telegram informing her that her son was missing and presumed lost at sea. She also received his Navy Cross and Purple Heart. The medals came in a wooden presentation box with a letter from the Secretary of the Navy expressing gratitude for her son's service and sacrifice. Henrietta Miller kept the box on her mantle for the rest of her life. She died in 1982 at age 88. The medals passed to Miller's nieces and nephews. They eventually donated the Navy Cross to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The Navy named a Knox-class frigate after Miller in 1973. USS Miller, FF Tone 91, served for 18 years before being decommissioned in 1991. The ship was then transferred to the Turkish Navy and served another 22 years under the name TCG Zafar. In 2020, the Navy announced that a new Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier would be named USS Doris Miller, CVN-81. The announcement came on January 20th, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The carrier is scheduled for construction beginning in 2026. When completed, it will be the first aircraft carrier named for a black American and the first naval vessel named for an enlisted sailor since World War II. The naming represented more than recognition of Miller's actions at Pearl Harbor. It represented acknowledgement of how the Navy had failed him and thousands of other black sailors during World War II. The service that had restricted Miller to peeling potatoes because of his skin color eventually elevated him to the highest honor it could bestow, having a capital ship carry his name. But Miller never knew any of this would happen. He died believing he was still just a mess attendant. He died in the same uniform, doing the same job the Navy had assigned him in 1939. The recognition came after he could not receive it. The mess attendant rating was eliminated in 1943. The Navy began slowly integrating combat ratings, though full integration did not occur until President Truman's executive order in 1948. By the Korean War, black sailors were serving in all ratings alongside white sailors. Miller's actions at Pearl Harbor had contributed to that change, though not as directly as his advocates wanted to believe. The real lesson of Miller's story was not that one man had overcome prejudice through individual heroism. The lesson was that institutional prejudice had prevented thousands of capable men from serving their country effectively. For every Doris Miller who got a chance to prove himself, hundreds of others spent their entire service careers in galleys and officers' quarters, their potential wasted by a system that judged them by skin color rather than capability. Miller shot down Japanese aircraft because circumstance forced the Navy to let him try. He rescued officers because the emergency made rank irrelevant. He became a hero because someone finally gave him a weapon and stopped standing in his way. How many other mess attendants could have done the same if given the opportunity? The Navy would never know. The system prevented them from finding out. The sharecropper's son from Waco, Texas, who the Navy said could only cook and clean, proved that the Navy was wrong. He proved it at 0804 on December 7th, 1941, behind a .50 caliber machine gun he had never been trained to use. He proved it again every day he served afterward, wearing a Navy cross while still performing duties the Navy considered beneath white sailors. Doris Miller's story is not about one man's exceptional courage, though he certainly demonstrated that. It is about a system designed to suppress talent and capability, and what happened when that system failed for 15 minutes on a sinking battleship. The system kept working after Miller died. It took 79 years for the Navy to name an aircraft carrier after him. But for 15 minutes on December 7th, 1941, the system stopped working long enough for one mess attendant to show what he could do when someone finally let him fight. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about mess attendants who proved the system wrong with courage and skill. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Doris Miller doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.